So my name is Trish Smithline. I'm with the FEMA Region IV office here in the Atlanta area. My background, though, prior to my coming to the region, was as an incident management employee. In other words, I was one of those folks that reports out to the disasters when they happen. And as such, I got to see a lot of substantial damage processes. So today we're going to talk about the very basics of substantial damage and substantial improvement process and the programs that you can put in place in blue sky days and during disasters or during the times of damage to structures. We will not be going into a lot of detail in some of the field work because we want to really hit the basics and the high points today. But what I would like you to do, if you are interested in more information at the end of this, get back with your Tennessee State folks and let them know that we would like to schedule some more of these with substantial damage and with the substantial damage tool. Today, we're going to talk about the basics of substantial damage and substantial improvements. We'll talk about where you get the values to use to make that determination, and we'll talk about how very easy it is to make the determination without any special software or anything else. But then we will do a real quick overview of the free software that's available to you. It's called the Substantial Damage Estimator tool. I'm just going to show you quickly what it looks like. And after we do that, we'll talk about what to do if someone disagrees with your evaluation. Again, very simple processes. This shows you the flow of the whole substantial damage process. And I'll briefly go through this in a minute, but there are just a couple of thoughts that I hope you come away with after this talk. If you remember nothing at all, I want you to remember these things. One is that substantial damage determinations are yours. They're the community's. It's not FEMA's, it's not the state, it is yours. So we want you to become very familiar with it because it is a part of your ordinance. Your goal is to bring structures into compliance with your ordinance to save lives and save property. And so that's the other thought that I want you to come away with. Your whole point in doing any of this is to save lives and save property. Up at the top row, you'll see the general activities, many of which you can do during blue sky days. You can determine what structures are in or out of floodplains. You can prioritize areas that you will need to look at, for instance, in the case of a flood. You can be ready for these disasters to happen. You can get your staff ready to or your contractors, or whichever way you choose to go with this, to provide labor to get out in the field, but you can have all of that ready to go in the event that a disaster happens. In the center row here, let's say that this is a flood, but keep in mind this is damage from any cause at all. Some of you, I'm pretty sure, are quite familiar with tornado damage, and still, if a structure is damaged even by a tornado, but it's in your special flood hazard area, this process still applies. And so in the determination phase of the substantial damage process, you're going out into the field, you're making your observations, and you are determining if a structure is or is not substantially damaged, and then you're notifying your homeowners of your determination. And lastly, after you finish your initial determinations and gathering the data and informing the community, you want to follow up, because after you make that determination, if we don't continue to follow up through the permitting process or with the homeowners, then we don't reach that goal of saving lives and property by making our communities more resilient. So let's jump into the definition of substantial damage. Remember, I said it's damage from any origin, not just floods, but anything that causes enough damage to a structure that the damage is equal to or exceeds 50% of the market value of that structure before the damage occurred. So you want the pre-damage value of the structure. Substantial improvement is the same thought process, but maybe not in the time of a disaster. Perhaps someone wants to add on to their home or redo any of it, really, even just roofing and things. It still behooves you to, through the permitting process, determine if the improvements they want to make equal 50% or more of their structure. If it does, that gives you the trigger to bring that structure into compliance with your floodplain ordinance. And again, remember, that's just if those structures are in the special flood hazard area. In blue sky days, it's important to let your community, the residents in your community, know about the concept of substantial damage. You would do that through your permitting process, and so you need to be sure you let your community know what activities do require a permit, what don't, and what substantially damaged means in the special flood hazard area. I think it's important to remind people that again, our goal is to save lives and save property. It's not to dictate what they do with their house, but it really is a positive influence on the community. We also want to break the cycle of disasters. We don't want to just keep throwing money at structures that need to be repaired. We want to bring them into compliance and get residents back into their homes faster by helping them get grants and other funding that can help them make their structures and your community more resilient. It also helps in neighborhoods that may be in special flood hazard areas and have not been maintained because of that. It can help you identify structures that are not meeting your ordinance. Keep in mind, like I said before, this is your information. You absolutely don't need to wait for FEMA or the state to collect this data after an emergence, after a disaster. You have various options of how to, excuse me, folks, of how to make these determinations. And using the substantial damage tool or other methods, we'll talk about those in a little bit. But what happens if you really don't follow up with these determinations or don't do the substantial damage observations at all? Remember that our whole reason is to bring your community into compliance with your ordinance. They're enhancing the NFIP program, and so therefore, if you don't, you could be have the possibility of probation from the NFIP program. And if you are suspended from that program, then flood insurance is not available to your residents. This very much impacts your residents, but also the growth in your community. And again, important to remember that we only care about the structures in the special flood hazard area. And you probably during your blue sky days are familiar with those areas. When we talk about the tool a little bit, you'll see that you can pre-populate that software with the structures that are in the special flood hazard area. There are two values that you need to determine substantial damage. And as we get into talking about this formula and what you need, remember that don't overcomplicate this. I always tell people, do not overthink this whole process. All you need to know is the cost of the repairs and the pre-disaster value of the structure. And it's that simple because you're just looking for the proportion of the cost of repairs to the structure value. And if it is greater than or equal to 50%, then mitigation needs to happen to bring that structure into compliance. If it's below 50%, then there are no further actions needed. So always remember, it is just a very simple concept of the cost of repairs divided by the structure value. It either is or isn't over 50%. And this is where I remind people, when you're thinking about determining a substantial damage, remember not to let yourself, I call it, get in the weeds. It's so easy to think about, well, what if that and what if this? And if any of you have construction and engineering backgrounds, you'll really try to overanalyze and almost nitpick what damage is. And I always like to remind people, we are only looking for a percentage, sort of a soft number. And when we look for that percentage, we're just looking for it to be either over 50% or under 50%. When you are determining these substantial damages, we find that if something is less than 40% of the structure's value damaged, there's very little that's going to change in your assessment and observations that will kick that determination over 50. So anything below 40, especially, don't dwell on or stress over determining the exact pennies on this. We also find that anything over 60% is pretty much going to be substantially damaged no matter how you slice it. There are very few observations you could reassess to make that figure below 50%. So what we're saying there is, when you're determining damage, really focus on the 40% damage to 60%, and be sure you're right on target with where those fall, because those can affect your substantial damage of over 50%. Let's talk about how you get that structure value. That's one of the key components. Very, very important to remember is that the value is for the structure only. It doesn't include the landscaping. It doesn't include detached buildings or structures, only the structure itself. And it also must be the pre-disaster value. I heard a great example out of another state once of somebody that did not do the repairs immediately. In fact, they waited about 10 years to do the repairs from an event. And the question came up, but how do we decide substantial damage or not from that? Well, you know what? It didn't matter that it was 10 years ago, because you still need the pre-disaster value of the structure. Not land, not landscaping, just the structure. There's several ways you can get that. You can develop a cost per square foot. You can multiply that cost per square foot on the square footage of the structure, and then factor in some depreciation, and that could give you a structure value. You could take assessed values. I want to caution you about that one. If you ask someone, or, well, not, you want to, when you're looking at tax assessed values, remember that sometimes your assessed values may be adjusted up or down for various reasons. I'll give you an example of that. I was working a disaster, and it happened to have been Texas, actually, I think. And there was a town that needed some rebirth downtown. They really wanted to attract businesses to come into town and redevelop their downtown area. So they had, when we pulled their tax assessment records, they had some structures that were, oh gosh, let's say a 2-story masonry building that was about 8,000 square feet total, that on the tax books, on the tax records, it was assessed at $4,000. Now, we know that's not really a very accurate assessment of the brick and mortar part of that structure. And so I always think that's a great example of remembering that your community may be adjusting your tax assessed values for various reasons. This community adjusted them down to attract business into their downtown area. And so we couldn't really use those tax assessments. But maybe you can use appraisals. And I'll talk a moment about what kind of appraisal. When you obtain an appraisal from, say, a property owner, a homeowner, be sure that the appraisal they give you is not an appraisal that was put together for a realtor. There's a difference in real estate appraisals for the sale of a property and the real estate appraisal for determining substantial damage or for determining the actual value of the structure, not always based on the market. Remember, we're looking at the value of the sticks and stones that were used to build that structure. So be sure that when you get an appraisal, you look at it closely and make certain it does not include the value of the land or the improvements to the land or any other detached buildings, and that it actually addresses the value and not the real estate sales value. You also, you may have some general contractors in your area that can help with estimates of structures in a general area. I don't really recommend that as your first approach. I think the others are better, but that is another way to go to get knowledgeable contractors' cost estimates on structures that are typical, almost like comps in a way, right? When you're buying or selling a house. We talked about the things to consider when you're using the tax data, and so always remember to adjust that tax information to reflect the true value of the structure and not the unadjusted tax value, which might be skewed one way or another based on what your community is going through right then. Let's say that you have a fire or a flood, and someone's structure's damaged, and they think this is a super time actually to do those improvements that they had always been thinking about. Let me go ahead and add that room on. Is that okay, folks? Yeah, it's perfectly fine. But when you are doing your substantial damage or substantial improvement evaluation, you'll always include those improvements in your evaluation, even though that part of the structure didn't exist when the damage occurred, and it was not damaged itself. It is still an improvement to the property. And so you're still only looking at those same two numbers we were talking about. The cost of the repairs and improvements compared to the pre-damage value. Not the value of the structure after this improvement's put on there. We're still only looking at the pre-damage value. But if it should come up, then yes, the additional improvements and enhancements to the house are included. So we talked about structure value. Let's talk about where we get the cost of repairs now. I think the best source for the cost of repairs after damage is to get a licensed contractor's cost estimate. Be careful or be observant when you receive those, because you want to be sure all of the applicable things, all of the repairs are on there. You want to be sure all of the labor costs are on there and the materials. And, you know, for that reason, as a community, you might allow owners' cost of repairs, owners' estimates for cost of repairs. And if you do allow an owner to give you a cost of repairs estimate, maybe they want to do their own work. Maybe they have a brother-in-law that's a plumber and he can do all that work, and the other brother-in-law is an electrician, so we got that covered, so it's not going to cost us much. No, you actually, their cost estimate must include all elements of repair. It has to market value of all materials, whether they're donated or not, accurate for the market, cost of labor, everything that would be involved, even if someone's going to do the work themselves. So we just talked about that. We want to be sure the cost estimates, wherever they come from, are accurate, reasonable, and complete. There is the substantial damage estimator. That's that software tool I talked about. There's a user's manual included in it, which gives you a good checklist for being sure that all of the essential elements are in your cost estimates. You can get that online. We'll have a link in a little bit, or you may have received it prior to this training. Remember, and we talked about, we want to be sure materials and labor are there, site prep, any demo that needs to be done, all the costs for everything, including the sales tax and the construction management, are eligible to be included in that estimate of repairs. But there are some things that are not, like the cost of the appraisal, the plans and specs, the permit fees. Again, all of this is denoted in that desk reference. Remember, we talked about donated, discounted, cannot be used at that value. That's great that it can be donated, that you have materials being donated. However, for the sake of the substantial damage or substantial improvement calculation, You must have accurate reflection of all cost involved in making that repair or improvement. So how do we do this? It's easy. Remember the formula that we talked about, the substantial damage or substantial improvement equation? You literally just do the math. If you get that, the appraisal and the contractor's cost of repairs, literally do the math of contractor's cost of repairs divided by the value of the property. Or you can use the free software tool I mentioned to you called the Substantial Damage Estimator tool. Always remember, though, that our goal is this 50%. If anything below that, it will not trigger coming into compliance with the ordinance. And that's why I always say, don't overthink this calculation. We're just looking for, is it over 50% or under 50%? If you use any of the methods that are not the appraisal and the contractor's estimate of repairs, then what you're going to come up with is, again, what I sort of call a soft number, an estimate. That's okay, because again, we're just looking for, is it over 50% or is it under 50%? And also remember that I mentioned, and we'll address in just a little bit, what to do if you provide that estimate to the property owner and they might disagree and they'd like to revisit it, and that's okay. So remember back here, we talked about exactly how easy it is to use this formula when you have the contractor's cost of repairs and the structure value. But let's say you don't have those. Let's say you need to put this information together quickly for your homeowners so that as they get ready to do the repairs, they can come through your permitting process and get on with repairing their structure and moving back in. This is that software tool I mentioned to you. It's called the Substantial Damage Estimator software or tool, or SDE. And remember that I keep saying estimate. That's the really important word in this. It's an estimate. It's not an engineering observation. We're not making any measurements. We're making an estimate, and that's okay, because we're just looking to come up with either over 50% or under 50%. What I'm going to do now is just show you very quickly some of the features of this software, just to give you an idea of what's there. We can, in a later session, go through this and talk details about it, but I just want to give you a little preview of what it looks like. It's like, I keep saying it is free and online, and this is the link. We can, I think we'll be able to provide these slides to you as well afterwards, so you'll have that link. It was designed as an easy tool for folks to go out into the field, make observations without having to measure anything much, and then determine whether that structure is or is not over 50% of its value damaged. It is so straightforward that folks in your workforce that do not have a whole lot of background in engineering or construction can actually make these observations as well. And so you should be able to put together good teams to go into the field and make the observations using these software tool. There are a few things you look for, both when you're making observations based on appraisals and cost of estimates, and also when you're using the substantial damage tool, such as the basic structure attributes. How many stories is it? What kind of foundation is it on? The building elements, such as what is the structure, the load-bearing walls, what are they? Are they wood frame? Are they masonry? Observations such as that. And then any other important adjustments, such as very high-grade construction, very low-grade construction, can also be included in your observations. Things, when you're in the field, you would look at things like, what type of structure is this? What kind of foundation, what kind of superstructure? That software I keep mentioning to you gives you options to choose from. You take photographs and you document your field with those, your files with those photographs. And you can import information as well in that software. You can look at not just residential buildings, but non-residential and manufactured homes as well. The software and your own thoughts when you're out in the field do not look at all the same attributes on residential and non-residential. And in the same way, if in your substantial damage calculation, what you got was a professional appraisal, that appraisal also looks at a few different attributes on non-residential as it does residential. There's when you go into the field, as you can imagine, there's certain tools you would need, and we won't dwell on these, but picture yourself going out to make the observations into the field. In a COVID environment, let's even think about the safe ways as you put together your plan in your head and for your community for those disaster times. There are a few measurements you're going to make when you're in the field, such as in this right here, the depth of the water above the ground, above the adjacent grade, and also above the floor, the first floor. Those are just a few measurements you'll make, but you'll see that you can use some worksheets that walk you through each of those. You don't have to, the things we talk about and some of the things that I breeze through to show you in the software, you won't need to carry those in your head. You don't need to memorize them. We've got some nifty worksheets that reflect that software as well. And this is an example of the residential worksheet wherein you can note the building attributes, the cause of the damage. Always remember, it doesn't have to be from a flood. It could be a fire, it could be wind, it could be earthquake. But if it is a flood, we want to know how long the water was up, how high did it get. We look at the quality of buildings, and then you get to the meat of the matter. The beauty of this software tool is that you look at each element by itself. You don't have to have someone very, very experienced in building construction or general contractor to eyeball a whole building and say, okay, I know that one's 42%. No, you can use this method to look at each individual element of the structure, just the foundation. What kind of damage did it get? Just the superstructure, just the floor finish and other areas. There's also, I mentioned to you before, the substantial damage estimator software has a very useful user's manual as well. And when you download this software, you'll see the link for the user's manual. We also have some cheat sheets, if you will. So again, remember, I keep saying we don't have to have folks that are experts in building construction to help you determine the substantial damage estimates. These cheat sheets, actually, this is an example of the one for foundation, that you can determine the water level and how much damage, and then rely on these columns to help you decide on the percentage of damage as you're looking at the damage to each of the elements. So again, I always want to remind you, don't get bogged down in the exact measurement of that damage. This is an estimate and a percentage. I mentioned the non-residential. We don't look at quite as many elements for a non-residential structure as we do a residential. So the field worksheet that you see here can help you walk through the non-residential damages as well. And same for manufactured houses. Few different elements that we look at. Photographs, when you are in the field to do a substantial damage or substantial improvement observation, photos are so important. I like to suggest that you take at least 2 to show perhaps all sides of the structure, and to show, if this were a flood, to show the depth of the water, and include the whole entire structure in that photograph. And by that I mean, see the top photo and the middle photo? I like to see a little sky above and a little land below, and space on the right, space on the left. We see that in these two. It gives you the full impact of the structure and the damage. The bottom, not such a good example of that. So I really like to reinforce with you all as you're documenting your substantial damage file with the photographs to be sure you get the whole structure. Sometimes I've had some teams go into the field and bring me back a picture of the front door. And sometimes they just get a picture of the house number by the front door. I think that what they're thinking is that they just need to prove that they were there, in case anyone questions that they actually were physically there. So, but always remember these photos, that's not the purpose. The purpose of these photos is to give you very good documentation for your substantial damage database and files so that you can look back and evaluate. Also, if someone goes through an appeal process, they would want to, you would want to refer back to what you saw in the field as well. I'm going to flip through a little bit quickly what the screens in the substantial damage estimator software looks like. We won't go tab by tab and talk much about them. I just want you to get an idea of what it looks like and how it could help you if you choose to use it. This first tab is the address tab. It just gives you the particulars of the property, where it's located, how you can find it. You can include owners' names or not. This information is not used in the calculation, but you do need it to be sure you get back to that same structure for your files. The second tab in the software talks about those attributes that we mentioned. What exactly is the building? How many stories does it have? And what's the roof covering? What kind of foundation does it have? This is the area you would record all of that. And you know, also in that area you would record information, excuse me, about the damage. When did it happen? How long did it happen? What was it even? Was it a flood or fire? What was it? On that next tab, that tab helps you determine the structure's cost if you choose to use a cost per square foot and the square footage of the structure. The software tool calculates that automatically for you so that, again, it saves you time in the structure value calculation. And it can help, again, that layperson that doesn't have a good feel for what structures may be valued at. This software tool can help you determine that. It's a very quick and easy way to do it. Here's the screen that gives you the meat of the matter. Each of those structure elements that we talked about, you evaluated them in the field, and here you record what your observation was for each element as it's the amount of damage for each element. But this shows you, again, the beauty of this software package is that this column shows you how each of these elements are weighted, because as you can imagine, the roof covering is not as large a cost component to the cost of the value of the structure as, say, the foundation is. So again, the beauty of this software or others like them is that this properly weights each of the elements into the amount of cost that they would need to contribute to the total damage, which is what you're coming out with at the end of this. And this is the screen that does give you that punchline. It tells you the percentage of substantial damage or substantial improvement, and that would appear right here. You can use this software, can give you a method to use any of the valuation things that we talked about and the cost of repairs. You know, remember we talked about, do we want to compute the value using the square footage and the cost per square foot, or do we want an appraisal, or are we going to use a tax value? You can choose which of those. And in the same vein, where did I get my damages? Did I let the software do it, or did a contractor give me an estimate of the repairs? In that way, this software tool can help you toggle between different methods if someone asks for a reassessment. Let me stress right here, though, that prior to doing any substantial damage observations after a disaster, you have to, as a community, choose your method of of damages and valuing the properties, and then you must use the same ones for all of the structures that you observe and evaluate. In other words, you always have to treat all of your residents in the same way. You can't use one way for one and one way for another. That is an especially important thing to remember as you're putting together your substantial damage program. Remember, we said several photos. You can put as many as you want. The database will handle them, but at least 2, maybe 3 or 4 are best. This software generates some reports for you as well. We're not going to go into a lot of detail today with our limited time, but in a future session we can look at and talk about the reports. Remember that after your observations and then your substantial damage estimate determination, you'll want to notify any of the property owners of that determination, in particular the structures who are deemed to be greater than 50% substantially damaged. This tool gives you a very good report that you can attach to your community cover letter that would include the property information and the substantial damage determination, and some lines at the bottom of that for you to sign as the authority, so that you don't have to come up with your own format to present this information to your community and property owners. There's also a detailed report it can print, which is literally everything, every bit of input that you put in there. What this software generates at the end of the day is a access database. That database can be used for your files. It is defensible should you ever need to prove what you did in court or in any other reason. It is considered a defensible database for you. And I've mentioned several times, there's a user's manual in the field workbook included with it. I want to stop for a tiny minute and ask if any of you have any questions. You can come off mute if you would like. Or raise your hand or type comments. Well, hearing none, I will go on and finish up with, we have gone into the field or we have received the information from our property owners and we have determined that substantial damage or substantial improvement estimate. What do we do when we send that information to our homeowners, but they say, no, really, I think it might be different? Well, that's okay. I'm going to skip forward just a second to what we can do. They can appeal it. And the way they do that is in consistent between all and bringing into you the actual contractor's estimate, licensed contractor's estimate of repairs and an appraisal. And that takes that estimate that you generated when you were in the field, that takes that from the estimate category, if you will, to a true representation of the percentage of damage as compared to the structure's value. Let's go back a second and talk about some exemptions. There are certain structures that do not fall into the whole discussion that we've just been through, and some of that would be if there are repairs or enhancements being done to a structure that correct code violations to bring a structure into safe living conditions. Different rules also apply to historic structures and the mitigation that can be done to them as well. The other element to consider after all of your substantial observations have happened, or you have completed your observations, is the increased cost of compliance, or ICC money, that is available to homeowners in their flood coverage and under the NFIP. And in order to be eligible, they of course must be located in the special flood hazard area and have that flood insurance policy in place. The damage does have to happen because of flooding. The ICC money only applies with flooding and not fires and tornadoes and things that we talked about that do affect substantial damage but do not come into play in ICC money. But the real important thing here is that they must have a substantial damage determination document from you. Well, remember that report I mentioned to you that you can generate from that software and send with your cover letter to your structure owner? That can be the determination that helps your community receive their ICC money. The ICC provides up to $30,000 to help bring that structure into compliance. And there are other particulars that we can go into in different sessions about insurance, but the ICC money helps homeowners are eligible for mitigation that we sort of lovingly call FRED. It's FRED are the various methods to mitigate a structure to bring it into compliance with your ordinance. And remember, the whole reason we're doing all that is, like I said, the thing I want you to take away today to save lives and property. So FRED stands for floodproofing, relocation, elevation, or demolition, the methods of mitigation to save lives and property in your community. Do we have any questions? That is the information, that's the overview I have for you today. And I wanted to leave a few moments at the end for some questions or comments. And I wanted to remind you as well that we have touched on many topics. What I would like to do is ask you if there are topics that we've talked about that you'd like to hear more about, maybe the specifics on that software tool or specifics on how you go out into the field. We could do examples of what you do when you're in the field. Please let your state folks know, and we'll schedule that as well. Any questions or comments?
I have a question.
Okay.
I'm getting some feedback.
You might have two devices turned on.
Possibly. Most of us are floodplain administrators.
Okay.
And I wanted to make sure whether or not the software that you demonstrated is also applicable to other disasters, natural disasters that are not necessarily related to flood, and should those be used by various building departments?
Well, the intent of that software is purely to determine substantial damage to come into compliance with your flood ordinance. So tell me more about what you're thinking other departments would use it for.
For other events other than flood, such as tornado or fire, as you mentioned, things like that.
Well, keep in mind, even if it's a tornado that came through, and I know you all are pretty familiar with that, you as the floodplain administrators are still concerned, no matter what the damage is, you're still concerned about any damage to the structures in your special flood hazard area. And so even after events of different causes, fire, tornado, I would think that you as the floodplain coordinator would then get involved with evaluating the damage to the structures in the special flood hazard area. Because, you know, I know that that's all the area that you're concerned about, but that still becomes your responsibility, or NFIP coordinator's responsibilities, to be sure that the structures in the special flood hazard area are evaluated for substantial damage. Did that answer that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Trish, we have a question here in the chat box. Manny asked, is there a pool of approved appraisers, and do they need to be vetted and approved prior to hiring?
I think that, well, I'll tell you the real answer to that is that is up to you all. It's your program. I have some information actually that I can forward to you all that discusses the difference in the appraisals, the different things to look for. I think if you had a way to vet some appraisers to be sure that they understand the intent of the use for substantial damage. I think that is a good idea. I do not know of a formal list that's already been vetted. I wish I did.
Alrighty. Looks. Okay, no, sorry. Andrew was just giving an answer in the chat box.
Anybody else? Well, folks, I think that would conclude my thoughts for today. I appreciate you all attending very much. And I believe, Josh, we can get the slides out to everyone if they'd like them, right?
Absolutely. I did send out a copy of the slide deck earlier today, just before the meeting, just in case folks had any trouble following along with any technological issues. So yeah, that'll be perfect. So if anybody has any questions they think of after the fact, feel free to email me, and I can forward them on to Trish and get you guys an answer. Also, as a reminder, I'm going to leave the chat up for a few minutes. I understand some of you tried logging out and logging back in to update your name, so you can get a continuing education credit. If that did not work for you, you could not change your name. I'm going to leave the chat up. Just go ahead and chat your first and last name for the next few minutes. Also, so everyone else knows, this webinar was recorded, courtesy of the Tennessee Association of Floodplain Managers. So we will have this webinar up on YouTube in the next couple of days. If you Google TNAFPM YouTube, you should be able to get that information, or you can email me. My email is joseph.gregory@tn.gov. I can also send you the link that way. So short of that, feel free to give Trish some love in the comments. Thank you again, Trish, for being willing to do this webinar for us. And everyone else, have a great day.